Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever it is that you are, wherever you may be. Thank you very much for making us a part of your day. I am Brad Franklin, a creative content writer here in Chesterfield, and I'm very glad to tell you that Chesterfield Behind the Mic is on the air once again. Summer is winding down. The fall will be here before you know it. And one of the things coming up this fall is a general election. Voters will go to the polls on November the 8th. Early voting begins in September. One of the things voters here in Chesterfield will be considering is a bond referendum. The Community Facilities Bond Plan will be on the ballot. Voters will be deciding whether or not the county should issue $540 million in general obligation bonds to cover 26 different capital improvement projects that will be paid for over 8 to 10 years. Those projects are broken into 4 different categories. You got schools, you got parks and rec, you got libraries, and you've also got public safety. Now, we are going to get into the ins and outs of all of those different projects in a later podcast down the road. But for today's purposes, we thought it would be a good thing to sort of start out with a look at what a bond referendum is, how they work, what they aren't, how they're paid for, how they're structured, all that fun stuff. And to do that, we got Matt Harris back on the podcast, Deputy County Administrator here in Chesterfield. Matt, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I like the fact that you said back on the show.
You like that?
Yeah.
The first return guest that we've had. Let's start there, Matt. What is a bond referendum? Because I think there probably are some people who are kind of not really sure, how it works or whatever. We'll get into, but in its most basic level, what's a bond referendum?
Yeah, so it's we only do these every 8 to 10 years. So it's a good point. It's a natural reality that people don't necessarily know what it is, but at its essence, the referendum piece just means it's on a ballot. So when folks go into the voting booth, this November, actually starting as early as September 23rd, which makes this year, a little bit different.
Right.
Just go in there to vote on candidates or other measures. There will be a question on there specifically relating to capital improvements in Chesterfield County. And it's a common occurrence used in every jurisdiction throughout the Commonwealth. And so basically all we're putting in front of the voters is, do you approve, this long-range capital plan for Chesterfield County? So,
right.
And we'll, like you said, you'll go through all the specific projects, but police stations, fire stations, schools, do you approve us or allow us to build these things over, and I think a really important thing is we don't do it overnight.
Right.
We've been out doing these town halls and other things, and I think people get a little, they're supportive in general about capital improvements and everybody wants nice facilities in their community, but if $540 million sounds like a
lot of
large
money,
price
right?
tag.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, we would never do that with cash. So we go out and just like folks would, I think the simplest metaphor for all of this is a household mortgage. You buy a $350,000 home, you're not going to pay cash more than likely. And so you're going to go to the bank, you're going to ask for a loan, and you pay it back over 30 years.
Right.
Same thing for us here. A couple subtle differences. We pay ours down over 20 years instead of 30, but basically we are going to the voting public and saying, okay, we need these improvements, these buildings. There's no people, there's no operational money.
No staff, right?
Yeah, this is all the bricks and mortar kind of stuff that you see when you're driving around the streets of Chesterfield County. Do you approve us to build $540 million worth of physical plant over the next decade, essentially? So we will borrow against that $540 million total if approved, but again, we do it over 10 years. So we're not going out day one and putting $540 million on the credit card and passing that bill through to the taxpayers.
Now, one of the things about the bond referendum, I think that might be, you referenced like buying a house. We don't do it necessarily with bonds, though. And that's, I think, the part for some people that causes some confusion. So what exactly is a bond, and why is, a general obligation bond? Why is that such an important part of the whole structure here? Yeah,
I mean, a bond for us is just essentially a loan. Again, just putting it back in those terms. So we go out and in the open market for us, and it's essentially large insurance companies and large financial institutions, large banks that will. It's an open and fair competition, and it's the lowest rate wins the day. And so we that's how we borrow money. We don't go to banks directly. We have a competitive process. We put out essentially an RFP or a request. Here's what we want, the amount we want to borrow for these improvements, and it all happens in about a 30-second time. All the bids are revealed. Lowest cost wins the day. So that's how we borrow money. We just call it a bond, but it essentially, again, it's a government loan.
Okay.
The GO piece, which is just, again, government speak, that is the best kind of obligation that we can get ourselves into. It's all it means is the full faith and credit of Chesterfield County.
Okay.
Not to make this super nerdy, more nerdier than it already is. There's lots of different kinds of ways that we can borrow,
right.
But general obligation just means that Chesterfield County stands behind this 100%, and we will pay this.
Right.
This loan back to whoever the financial party is. So that's the creme de la creme of public finance. But we can only access, that kind of financing if voters approve.
If approved, right?
Right. So that's why we put it on the ballot. So we put it on the ballot. Do you approve this long range capital plan, and do you allow us to use this special kind of financing that's full faith and credit? And the other piece that goes along with that means we get the low, and this is, I think, where people really start to perk back up. It allows us to get the lowest cost of issuance. So we talk a lot about our, credit rating as a county. Again, very comparable to somebody at home. They've got, you got Equifax and all those folks that rank you. You got 3 different scores, and you can keep track on all that stuff. Same thing happens for us. Chesterfield County is amongst the rare localities in the country. There's only about 30 or 40 of us that have a perfect credit rating from all 3 agencies, but that you really get to utilize that the most in this instance when you're going through a GO sale. Means we can get in that highest tier of security. We can also get the lowest rate in that highest tier. So it lowers the borrowing cost.
Gotcha.
That's why it matters. When we're paying out on this loan for the next how many ever years, the least amount of money is going to go towards interest, more towards principal. And that has a couple of things. Obviously, paying interest is not a fun thing for anybody.
Right.
But it keeps taxes as low as they can be, and it frees up other money for operational things.
Right.
Staffing, pay, teachers, cops, firefighters, all of that apple pie type stuff.
Right.
Is not diverting more money that is needed into paying interest on these bonds. So getting the GO approval and having that perfect credit rating keeps the interest costs low, allows us to put the improvements on the ground, in an efficient manner without, sort of putting that saddle on the rest of the organization, or ultimately, of course, most importantly, the taxpayer.
Right. Now, in terms of, you mentioned, that going this route means the county can essentially do it at the lowest cost. Do you have an idea of how much the county would save by going this route to essentially to achieve these goals versus another route to do it in a different path? How much would the county save doing it this way?
Yeah, so we just try to put that in context, because again, these are concepts that unless you're in this space, they're a little bit foreign. I understand that. So we just looked at somebody with our credit rating and somebody with basically a notch below.
Okay.
And so borrowing the same amount of money on either one of those scenarios, it would save between $20 and $25 million of interest over the duration of this 8 to 10 year period that we're talking about. So that's real money.
Right.
And we can equate that to, basically 2 of our projects on the county side, the entire cost of those.
Right.
So it really does matter. You're not just stand up saying, well, AAA and low cost, like $20, $25 million. People are like, yep, that sounds
a significant,
legitimate.
Yeah, that's a significant. And I'm curious too, like, I think we have a general sense as a public of what capital improvements are, right? These are big ticket items. These are things that like you said, brick and mortar, they're not staffing. They are big picture stuff. But I'm curious, how did the county gonna go about picking these projects? Again, we're going to get into the ins and outs of what all they are down the road, but I'm just curious, how did this list of these 26 come to be?
So first thing I think it's important to point out, we only borrow for stuff that has a useful life that far exceeds the borrowing period. So we don't borrow money for operations, for paychecks, light bills, for your beautiful studio here, anything like that. Things that are legitimate physical things you can walk into, buildings that are going to have a useful life of, in some instances, some of these schools we're talking about replacing are at or over 100 years. So you don't want to borrow or put money out for something that has its useful life is less than the period of time which you would borrow. So that's the first criteria. It's got to meet that test, or it's not something we are going to borrow for. There are a lot of local governments that borrow just to kind of keep the lights on. Right. So we just make that distinction for folks. We are only talking about, capital stuff that you can, tangible things you can go touch and feel. So picking the projects, we thought we'd be doing this in November of 2020.
Right.
Obviously, COVID had
something
better,
different.
had other thoughts on that. So we've had a 2 to 3 year period where we've been out talking to the community about, here's kind of the list of projects, the eligible projects. So it's been a long dialogue with folks trying to dial that list in because our capital needs far exceed $540 million.
Right.
So how do you fit the ones that are in there? So we've had a long period of time to be able to do that. And so some of those criteria, obviously, public feedback and public dialogue is going to be at the top of the list.
Right.
We have a lot of analytics, that we do when we're talking about kind of forecasting future demand. Where are people going to live tomorrow? That can we put facilities in to try to stay at least on pace with where service demands are going to be? There's been a big push on revitalization. Again, we got 2 schools as part of this package that are effectively 100 years old.
Right.
I think they've served their purpose. So
right.
Making sure that we have parity and that all the facilities, no matter where in the county, you kind of get an even, experience when you go into them. So that's really important. And then there's economic considerations. You'll have Gerard or Joe or somebody here talking about a specific project, but in the police instance where you're in long-term leases and where we're looking to convert those to county-owned facilities, so that will pay for itself,
right.
Pretty quickly. So
right.
we always look for opportunities where it makes sense from a physical plant perspective, but also if it's got that payback from we're getting out of leases across the board. This is really sort of the last things, but that's another consideration that we certainly have in there.
Now, one of the things too is, and with I think all bond referendums, there's always an idea of like, how much each bucket, so to speak, right? Each category, right, goes. And I'm just curious if you can break down for us the schools versus county projects that are in this. And again, we're going to go through the ins and outs of each individual project, but in terms of each one of those categories, I'm just curious if you can kind of break those down for us.
So again, just some background stuff. We have one credit card, if you will. So
right.
It's one referendum. It's one question. County and schools, they don't have their own debt capacity. Actually, by law, the school board can't enter into indebtedness. Only the board of supervisors. So it's managed collectively. It's one effort. It's one question. It's one website. Working closely with the schools to put this whole thing together. So I just want folks to understand. With the board of supervisors has the taxing power. They also have the power of indebtedness, and so that is kind of how that all comes together.
Right.
The 4 categories are education or schools, public safety, parks, and libraries. Those are the 4 that we're looking at here. Schools has the lion's share of that, $375 million. And that's really just because of the unit cost of what they're dealing with.
Right.
I mean, a middle school nowadays is going between $90 and $100 million. So it's not that they have more projects necessarily in the other categories. Right. It's just that building a school, the size of it, and all the intricacies of that, it's just more expensive.
Right.
So that's why they have the larger piece. And then the other categories are really kind of evenly split, around 40 plus or minus for parks, 40 plus or minus for libraries,
right.
and then public safety is split 40-40 for police and fire.
Okay. And then in the bigger picture, as this thing works forward, right, I think that there, because bond referendums only come around every once in a while and people don't see them as often as they go to vote, right? I think one thing that we've seen, at least in terms of some uncertainty, right, is how the vote matters to the bond, right? In the sense that, like, will the county be able to, essentially, is this the one vote? Is this the one voice? And certainly, in jurisdictions around us, there have been lots of different things, whether it's casinos and whatever. And I'm just curious if you can put that one to rest. Is like, is this going to be, an approval or rejection all at once in one vote?
Well, I can put one thing to rest, Brad. There's no casino as part of this referendum. Let's clear that up. To scratch that from the. No. So it's you go in. It's one question. Do you approve?
Right.
In layman's terms, approval of this long-range capital plan to be financed by these kind of special
right.
bonds that we've talked about. If
right.
you vote yes, you're approving. If you vote no, obviously that's what that means. But these questions can be worded kind of weirdly. So,
right.
We do point that out as we go through.
Right.
If you vote yes, you're saying, yes, I want these projects to be paid for by this special type of financing.
Right. And then last one before we wrap up, I know that there's a lot of work.
We're just getting started. It's going to be warmed up there.
I mean, look, if you want to break down every project, I mean, hey, but no, I'm just curious. You mentioned 2020 and the dialogue and stuff. I'm just curious the amount of work that went into this entire process of putting this whole thing together. I'm just curious, like, how that works, and if you can shed some light sort of on the intricacies of it, and the amount of time, right, that you guys have put into figuring out what was the best way to do it and how to put it all together for the voters in November.
Yeah, no, I mean it's an in-depth process. We do a capital process as part of the budget every single year.
Right.
So we're always sort of evaluating our long-range capital needs, but again, every 8 to 10 years, you got to package them together. You go out and you get this authorization, and it helps to plan. It's when you're doing things, with dollar figures that are like this, we want to make sure that we can think multiple years in advance, whereas the operational budget is much more flexible. It changes year to year. Conditions are much more, up and down. When you're doing a capital plan, there's, from the design to the bid to the construction windows, you got to layer all that stuff out. You really have to think. In a 10-year block is very reasonable. So it's really just a culmination of, several years of work, but we're always kind of working on that long-range plan. And a couple other disclaimers that I have to make while I'm with you, Brad, is first and foremost, this is not representative of every project. So when you have the next two guests talk about the specifics, this is really things that we've documented. We know exactly we need these. There's going to be things that come up. And I think one of the big questions we get is, well, what about my project, or what about this, or what about that? There's always ways for us to come back as conditions change and fit in other projects. And we've got a really good track record, particularly on the school front, of being able to do that. So I don't want folks to think this is the only thing that we're going to build or construct for the next 10 years. That's not true. We leave flexibility in there, but these are things that we know today we can bank on. These are good projects. A 100-year-old school is not going to get any younger.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point. On the paying for this, just a quick note. The last time we went out with a referendum, it did have a meals tax component. That's not included here. We don't feel like we need that to be able to pay for this package, but that begs the question, well then, Mr. Harris, how are you going to pay for these? And so it really goes back to the way that we handle our business.
Right.
We're talking about paying down debt. We pay all of our loans, if you will, our mortgages on level principal. That means that, when you get your mortgage payment every month, or you see the bill come in, it's an even payment. For us, we take the entire principal amount and we chop it up and we pay that same amount every month. So that means it's much higher at the beginning and it starts to tailor off by the end of that 20-year term. Right. So that gives you this slope effect where we are paying down debt much more aggressively than a lot of our peers, certainly than any folks in Washington, D.C. would ever comprehend. And but that gives us an opportunity. And so when we talk about we're able to pay for this because of that structure, as that slant begins to emerge, we can then put in more debt on top of that in that space that's created by retiring other loans that fall off the books. We then add a new one, and our total cost, our total principal and interest payment really doesn't change that much because we are paying stuff off so aggressively. We're getting it off the books, and you create capacity within that same, bank of dollars to add more debt to do more projects, as opposed to just stacking on top of what's already there, and then you see your debt costs, skyrocket over time. We do it very, very differently. So that's kind of the secret sauce that allows us to be able to go out, tell the public, yep, we want you to entrust us with $540 million of debt over 10 years, but it's not going to put pressure on your taxes. It's not going to require a new tax such as a meals tax. And thirdly, it's not going to crowd out, everybody wants to have teachers and police officers or whatever paid more and pay attention to those core services from an operational perspective. It doesn't crowd out those opportunities either. So that part's really, really important. Cool.
Well, where should people go if they have questions, they want to learn more about the community facilities plan?
We're a little bit everywhere right now, from billboards to ads in the newspaper, and really it's not an advocacy position, So I'd say that for the lawyers here today, but we wanted to give information. So We've got our blogs, the podcast. Again, we are taking advantage of billboards out there. You can go to Chesterfield.gov/bond. All of this information is there. All of our social media accounts have stuff. We're going to have a Facebook Live town hall that folks can, if you have questions and you want to get a hold of a live person, unfortunately it'll probably be me. You can do that. We're going to go out and do meetings in each of the magisterial districts.
Yep.
And have sort of live question and answers. And I think a really interesting, unique opportunity, we have our Speakers Bureau where you can go on Chesterfield.gov or just Google Speakers Bureau Chesterfield.
Right.
And you can sign up, and we will send out a handsome team of speakers to talk to you and your neighborhood association, civic group, church, whatever it is. If you want a special, sort of presentation to your group, and we're getting a lot of those requests.
Right.
So we do make house calls as well.
Good deal. Well, Matt, thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Brad.
All right. Now, you can make sure you check us out on social media. On Twitter, it's at Chesterfield VA. On Instagram, it's Chesterfield, Virginia, all one word. And on Facebook, you can check out our podcast page. Just search Chesterfield Behind the Mic. Make sure you like that page so you can keep up with us as we go forward. Now, let me tell you about all the ways you can check us out. You can watch us on our YouTube channel, as well as on our website at Chesterfield.gov/podcast. An audio-only version of the show is available there, as well as on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, and a whole host of other services. You can also watch the podcast on WCCT Thursday through Sunday at 7, on the weekends at noon. That's Comcast Channel 98 and Verizon Channel 28. And lastly, you can check out Chesterfield.gov/connect with us. More ways for us to get in touch with you and you to get in touch with us. My thanks to my director, Martin Stith, and all the good folks here in communications and media for making this possible. And my thanks to you for joining us today. So, from all of us here in Chesterfield, thank you very much for joining us. Have a good day.